Alright, so we're back here with the 15th episode of the Ready Nimble Larson Speedrun series. We are playing against 3 different players in the rating range of 2,000 up to 2,100 this time. And let's get right into it. So, knight f3, d5, we're playing b3. Playing against JSI Yuda, rated 2015 from Canada. So we continue with bishop to b2 here. And we will kind of decide what to do against our opponent's setup. So black is playing kind of some early queenside developing moves here. Now, our general heuristics for what to do with the light square bishop, we tend to decide between the moves e3 and g3. We go for e3 if we plan on putting the bishop on b5. Usually that's a little bit easier to rationalize if the pawn has already moved up to c5 or if the knight has gone to the c6 square instead. Right now, e3 and bishop b5 doesn't really make a lot of sense because black can play c6 to block the bishop. So I think we are going to stick with the g3 move here. I do think you could throw in the move c4. I think that's actually a pretty decent move to also consider here. And it might be worth just kind of chucking it in to see what black does. But let's stick with g3. We'll kind of stick with our typical setup here. Go bishop g2, get castled, and we will throw in c4 at the right time. Pretty much at any moment would be fine to go for, but I think we'll just castle first and then we'll throw out c4. c4, knight c3. Okay, we'll go c4 now that we're castled. And the game plan is to play knight to c3, and generally speaking, we're going to try to go for a d4, and then later we'll try to play the move e4 if we can get that going. So you could start off with d4. There is some logic behind that. If we go knight c3, there is maybe the possibility of black playing e5, but moving the e-pawn 2 times in the early game, especially when black is not able to castle just yet, could open us up, or open them up to some potential trouble in the center of the board if they're not careful. I think we're just going to stick with knight c3, but we are going to play d4 pretty soon here. Most likely next move. It could also be good to trade pawns on d5, and then a d3 e4 setup could also be good to go for. The one drawback to playing d4 in these situations is that black could throw the knight into the e4 square, and it kind of makes it a little bit more difficult for us to get in one of our e4 pawn breaks. So what I'm going to do here is, I think I am actually going to trade the pawns and then go for a d3 e4 setup. The reason I like to trade the pawns before going for that setup is because if we go for d3 right away, let's say black castles, we play e4. Once the pawns are traded, I kind of don't, how do I put it? I like the fact that the center of the board is a bit more opened up when we have, let's say, kind of 2 pawn trades occurring. Maybe is the way I would word it. So I think I'm going to go for that setup. Let's take on d5. I assume they're going to take with the, oh, they take with the c pawn. It's an interesting option. It's a little more common to take with the e pawn, but taking with the c pawn is not as common. Now, the downside of using the c pawn is that it was doing a good job of limiting our knight on the c3 square. Now our knight has the b5 square available to jump into at some point if we really wanted to. Going there right now doesn't really do anything since black will just attack it. But it could be something we use at some point down the road. I think given the circumstance, I'm still going to play d3 and try to work towards the e4 pawn break. Because if we can get rid of the d5 pawn, then the bishop on g2 also wakes up quite a bit more, I would say. So can we get e4 in right now? It would be ideal if we could do this. The question would be, of course, if black takes the pawn, what are we doing as a follow-up? We could play knight h4, we could play knight d4, attack the bishop on f5. It could be a scenario where we potentially gambit a pawn for a short-term, let's say, like piece activity compensation. I think we could consider playing e4. They take, maybe then we play knight to d4, attack the bishop. The downside there, though, is they're going to play bishop g4 and hit our queen, which is not ideal. So the other approach here is to play, we could try knight d4 first, kick the bishop back, then play e4, but I'm a little bit bothered by the move e5, which is kind of annoying. The other way of doing this is just to play rook e1 and try to play e4 after that, which is also totally fine. I think think we'll go for that approach. Let's go rook e1, try to set up the e4 pawn break. And it's not super easy for black to stop it. They could play knight c5 here, but this knight's easy to kick around with maybe like a b4 type of move at the right time. And assuming we can get the pawn break e4 in, again, once the pawns are traded, then this bishop is going to be sent back most likely to h7. That bishop's going to be shut out a little bit because the e4 pawn's doing a good job. We'll have more space in the center of the board, and we'll also be able to maybe one day open up our bishop on g2. So bishop to b4 is not a bad idea. It does prevent us from playing e4 because black wants to take our knight on c3 and eliminate our knight that's protecting the center. The downside to this, though, as far as I can tell, is I think we can just kick this bishop around. And if he trades off his bishop for the knight, we do gain the pair of bishops, which is definitely a bit of an asset we can work with. So instead of taking our knight, they're retreating. Let's stick with the move e4 or b4. We'll kick the bishop back once again, and now I think we can push the pawn up to e4. And I think this has pretty much just been a big net positive for us, because the bishop on b6 is not doing a ton. Our f2 pawn is well defended, and at the same time, this knight on c5 on d7 cannot come up to the c5 square anymore because our pawn covers that. So e4 looks pretty good. We could also go knight to a4, kick the bishop back a little bit further, but then it's still kind of hard to pull off e4 because the knight's no longer supporting the push. So I think we'll go for e4 right away. They do take, we take back. Next, we'll probably put the queen on the e2 square to help support the pawn, and then I want to get the rooks on the open c and d files. I think that's kind of the setup I would really like to go for. So they do retreat. We could consider e5, but I'm a little bit bothered by knight g4 attacking this pawn. It's a little bit awkward to protect. We would have to play some kind of rook e2 or rook e1. The downside of e5 is it does open up the bishop on h7 once again. So that's something we'd have to kind of contend with. Though I would say at the same time, if we go e5 and the knight goes to g4, if we do something like rook e2, we are threatening h3, and then the knight would pretty much be trapped, which is bad news for black. And that's not that easy for them to solve, I would say. Especially because this knight can't move off of d7 easily. So maybe we should consider playing e5. We kick the knight backwards. If the knight does not go to g4, if it goes backwards to e8, then we can maybe play knight to e4 and have a very strong knight in the center. So the more I'm looking at it, the more I think I am going to play e5. I assume they'll go to g4, and then my plan is to play rook e2, protect the pawn, but also even set up ideas of rook to d2 to attack the knight on d7 that's pinned. And it's, again, not that easy for black to solve these problems. h3 is the immediate threat, because then the knight on g4 would have no squares to move to. Black would pretty much have to take on f2, and gaining two minor pieces for the rook and pawn is usually a bit more favorable for us. And otherwise, again, even rook to d2 is a pretty big threat. This knight on d7 is going to run into some trouble. If black plays something like queen to c7 attacking the pawn, I think we can still play h3 anyways, or at least it's a move we might be able to consider. Because if they do take the pawn on e5, we can trade a few times, play knight to b5, attacking the queen, and opening up the attack on the e5 knight. I think that should work out for us. So again, h3 is the biggest problem, and I think if black could play knight c5 here, they could maybe stir up some counterplay, but again, because the bishop kind of went all the way around on the queen side, black does lose that ability to do that, I would say. So we can go knight b5 even right now, attack the queen, and the queen needs to keep the knight protected on d7 as well. And if black plays something like, let's say, queen to c6, then we have knight to d4, queen goes back to c8, knight into d6, we take the b7 pawn. Looks pretty bad for black, I would say. I do wonder if we go knight b5, can black just take on f2 anyways? I don't think so, but it is at least something to consider. Knight b5, knight takes f2, attacking the queen, and then we take on f2, trade a few times, they check on b6, but we can always bring our knight back to d4 to block everything. All that being said, I think that we can still play h3 anyways. I'm just checking though. h3, maybe they take f2, trade a number of times. Maybe they take e5. They have queen b6 check ideas, which are kind of annoying. I do have to play quicker here. I think I'm just going to go for this move, knight to b5 first. I think we'll just pester the queen to begin with. We also open up the defense of the b2 bishop to guard the pawn. The queen needs to go to one of these 3 squares. But it's very risky to go to the c6 square. I mean, you're walking right into this bishop. So I think now I will go knight to d4. I block off this bishop on b6. I open up the attack on the queen. Now the queen has to go back to c8, I believe, or c4, but then we can play knight to d6 either way. And maybe even throw in the move f4 to defend our pawn. I think our piece activity is just going through the roof here, and I think black's in big trouble because of that. We even have rook to c1 type of stuff. I think we'll go here first, though. Let's continue pestering the queen. Queen goes here, hit the queen again. Queen moves away, take the pawn at some point. Stuff like that. Oh, I think I also just missed a tactic. Would it work? No, I guess it wouldn't work. Maybe I had rook to c2 I was thinking about, because that would attack the queen as well as the knight, but the bishop does cover the c2 square, so I don't think that that would have worked. There might be some other moves that are stronger than what I'm doing, but it looks very nice. Our pieces are moving up the board very nicely. This knight still is running a little low on squares. Here, for instance, I can take the pawn and attack the queen more if I want to. That pawn is also not really running away anytime soon, so it might be totally fine to just leave it there for a moment. Maybe just play a move like pawn to f4 to defend the e5 pawn is also good. I think I'll just do that. We're just going to keep everything under control. h3 is still a very big threat to trap the knight. It didn't work last move because black could have taken the e5 pawn, but right now it's definitely a threat now that e5 is defended. My knight on d4 is pinned, but there's not really much black can do about that. And yeah, I think as far as I can tell, we're just in very good shape. Could have also taken the b7 pawn. I think that would have also been totally fine as well. So he does play h5 because he wants to give himself an escape square with his knight. Now I do think I will take the pawn. Might as well grab that now that we're not worried about the e5 pawn anymore. Attack the queen. Queen probably goes to e7 is my assumption. And then, yeah, maybe now I'll play h3, kick the knight backwards. And I do want to get off of this lineup that the bishop has, which is kind of annoying. So I think I'll do this. Kick the knight. We can also bring this knight backwards, open up the attack on the rook first. And then next move, king h2, try to play knight c6, and maybe even trap this queen if black's not careful. Okay, king h2, knight c6 is a very big threat. I think that black has to take our knight. I think it's too much of an issue to leave our knight on the board, but then we'll just take with the queen and attack the a7 pawn. And we're going to be up one pawn, fantastic pieces, very good position, so they do take. We're now attacking this pawn. This knight is still out of the game. We have the pair of bishops. Yeah, I think we're in fantastic shape here. Let's just play rook c1 and get on the open file. It's probably going to play rook to d8. Okay, here we're going to trade the knights, I think. Let's just do that, and then probably I'll bring my queen into d6 and just trade queens. Without the queens on the board, it should be a pretty easy win with the bishop here and extra pawn. So that's the idea here. If the queen retreats, I think we can continue attacking the queen, and black's going to have a hard time keeping the queen safe in the long run. So if they do trade, we'll take back with the pawn. We get our pass pawn. We can always play bishop f3 and then maybe g4 to mobilize the kingside pawns a bit more. We are down about 3 minutes though, so we have to pick up the speed of play, but we are much, much better at this point for sure. Okay, maybe I don't want to rush to trade queens and give them the open file, so maybe I'll just play, let's say, rook to d2. I really would rather black take me than me take them and give them the open file. g6 doesn't really do a whole lot. I think I can move the rook in and attack the pawn. Now bishop f3 and g4 would almost trap this bishop. So taking the pawn is the real threat. If black pushes the pawn, I think I'll just take it. And yeah, we're in pretty good shape, but again, not a ton of time on the clock. Let's see how we can crunch things out here. Bishop d4 attacking the knight also looks pretty good at the right time. Okay, we're only down 2 minutes this time instead of 3, so catching up on time slightly. Okay, we do get the pass pawn. We can put the bishop here and just push the pawn down the board. Looks pretty straightforward. We've got the c4 square covered, so that's not a problem. Push the pawn, put the bishop here, and promote is the game plan. I guess we'll push the pawn first. Now bishop f6 is the idea. Maybe bishop f6 first was a little bit more precise. They do have the move e5 opening up the attack on d7, which is a little bit annoying, but I think we just take with the bishop on e5, and we're also lining up towards the rook on b8. So I think we have some tactics that we can take advantage of there. For example, if they take on d7, we can take and then open up the attack on that rook. And if they don't take the pawn, we'll just play bishop c6 to protect it, and then bishop f6 is still the idea. Even rook takes a7 and just win with the queenside pawns. Okay. This way of doing things allows us to open up the attack on the rook. We'll take the rook. If they take our bishop, we have the check on the back rank. Check there, take the knight. And yeah, now it's just a bit of a speed thing. Let's just move the rook here. I'll play bishop d5 to target the pawn. Not a great way to protect the pawn without trading the bishops, but once you do that, you check, take this pawn, move over here. Now I can just push the b pawn up the board. Nothing for black to do really. And we will start the staircase checkmate sequence. And that is going to be that. Okay, so we got the win on this one. Let's go ahead and move over to the game review board and we'll check out the game and do some more analysis. All right, it looks like we played at a 87.9% accuracy. Must have had some mistakes in there. Yeah, it looks like we had 1 miss, 2 mistakes. I guess we'll figure out what those were as the game goes on, or as the review goes on. So let's review it here. All right, let's check it out. So we start off with knight f3. They go for d5, b3, bishop f5, bishop b2, knight goes to d7. And yeah, so as I said during the game here, when you're trying again to decide where to develop your light square bishop to, generally speaking, in a setup like this where black has not committed the pawn to c5 and has not committed the knight to c6, it usually makes a lot more sense to play g3 and bishop g2. Computer points out you could also play d3 if you wanted to, but it does say that g3 is the move you would play a little bit later on. So we decided to go for g3 right away. h6 is a little bit odd, a little bit slow. It does give the bishop an escape square in case we attack it, but doesn't really do anything to bother us in the short run. So we develop our bishop, we castle, and then I did go for the c4 pawn break. May not be the absolute best pawn break, apparently playing d3 and then working towards knight to d2 and e4. This is kind of a different way of doing things. I did play d3 and e4 a little later in the game, but I went for c4 first. c6, knight c3, bishop e7. Here I did go for the trade of pawns, and then did go for the setup with d3. If you're going to trade the pawns, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to play d4 afterwards. It also doesn't make a lot of sense to play d4 and then trade the pawns. That version of things is generally not very good for white, mainly because you kind of have no pawn breaks left over in this position. The only other pawn break you can really work towards is pawn to e4, and black just has that square really well covered. You could try some kind of minority attack on the queen side in this type of pawn structure, but the bishop on g2 doesn't really contribute to helping out with that pressure. So this would actually just be a good version of things for black. So if you're going to play d4, I do think it's playable. Like, for instance, here the computer does say d4 is also good to go for. But after castling, you would not want to take the pawn. You don't really want to combine d4 and pawn takes d5. You kind of want to do one or the other, is what it comes down to. This setup, I think we could also go for d4 followed by knight to d2 and then e4. Computer points out some ways that black can create some counterplay, but I think that this position looks totally fine for white as well. I ultimately decided to trade the pawns, then played d3, they castled, and I went for rook e1 to prepare e4. Apparently it is possible to play e4 right away. e4 takes, knight takes, and the computer says after knight to d4 we attack both the bishop and the knight. If black trades on c3, we're attacking the bishop as well as the pawn. And I think this was similar to something I was mentioning during the game. I was mentioning some scenarios where maybe we sacrifice a pawn for some piece activity. This would be kind of similar to that, where we are down a pawn for a moment, but we're hitting the bishop, we're hitting the b7 pawn, and pretty much white is still definitely in the game, even though we are down a pawn. I decided to prepare this pawn break a little bit more instead. That's where I played rook e1. Bishop to b4 felt like a little bit of a mistake during the game, and after we do chase the bishop backwards, now white is back in control, or definitely having the advantage here. We got in that e4 pawn break, bishop got sent backwards. I went for e5, which is not necessarily the best move, and apparently black can consider taking on f2 right away. But the computer points out if they take on f2, the best move is to play a5 rather than taking the rook, and I'm not really so sure why this should be better for black. And even though it is maybe a tiny amount better for black, I think I would be generally fine playing white's, playing the position where black is inevitably going to take the rook. We're going to have two minor pieces versus the rook. I think that white should be fine in these positions, even though the computer says black has like a very, very minuscule advantage. I don't think it's that big of a deal. Queen to c7 was not that great though. I went knight b5, which apparently is still not the best move. And this is one of those spots where knight takes f2 was available. And I mentioned this during the game, but I didn't really get the impression after queen b6 check and knight to d4, I didn't really get the impression that black was better here. I mean, once again, we still have the two minor pieces versus the rook. I guess the drawback is that our king is in a little bit of a precarious location. But even with that being said, I don't really see white being in too bad of shape. I mean, maybe I just move the king backwards, develop, feels like the two minor pieces should be pretty decent in the long run, but hard to argue with the computer. That being said, black did not go for that. They played queen to c6, and now we start kind of taking over. Knight to d4, queen moves, hit the queen again, queen moves, I could have taken the pawn right away. I went for f4 first. Then I took the pawn, and we're firmly better for the rest of the game, I believe. King h2, now we're threatening knight c6 to trap the queen. They eliminate the knight, we take back. And for all intents and purposes, we're just up a pawn with a much better position. Made the trade. Maybe trading is not the best way to do things, but we're still better. And ultimately got the job done. We used our passed pawn, won material, and won the game a bit later on down the road. Okay, so this is our first game. Let's go ahead and move on to our second one. We'll check that out. All right, we got our second game here, playing against Javad Yusfiesel, rated 2070. We're starting off with our knight f3 move, of course, continuing with pawn to b3. Let's see what setup this opponent decides to go for. So they go for an early knight c6. We go bishop b2 to restrict the e5 idea. They go bishop g4. And the setup that we are going to go for is going to involve e3, with the idea of putting the bishop on the b5 square, especially because black has developed their knight to c6 early in the game. We could throw in h3 first, or we can go bishop to b5 first. I'm not sure if it makes a huge difference. I think I'll go for bishop to b5 first, and then we can throw in h3 next. Black could bring the bishop back to d7 to break the pin, but it feels a little weird to go to g4 then back to d7. So we're going to go for this. Now we'll throw in the move h3, attacking the bishop. And now if the bishop goes back to h5, I think we have a pretty good sequence of events here. I think we can continue here with pawn to g4. Bishop retreats again, if I can draw arrows correctly. Knight jumps into the e5 square. And then we are applying pressure to not only the knight on c6, but we're also applying the pressure to the bishop that's on g6. And that becomes very relevant here in a moment. So we'll play g4, then knight e5, attack c6. I think queen to d6 is the only way to really protect the knight. I think queen to d6 is pretty much mandatory here. And now we have two different ideas. Number one, bishop a3 would be fantastic if the queen had to go back to d8. Of course, right now, though, they would just take our knight, so that's bad. So we can't go bishop a3. So we could try d4 with the idea of playing bishop a3, but I'm a little bit bothered by d4. Maybe black checks on b4. We block with the knight. They try to attack our knight that's pinned. It might still work out for us. It gets a little messy. What I'm going to go for instead here is a different approach. I'm actually going to go for the move h4. And the idea of h4 is we want to play h5 and we just want to trap the bishop. One of the only good ways of saving the bishop is going to be for black to push their own h-pawn. But as soon as they move their h-pawn, we will be able to take the bishop on g6 and mess up black's pawn structure. Because if we rush to take the bishop on g6 right now, black would take with the h-pawn. But if we can create a situation where the h-pawn has already been moved forward, if we can encourage black to play h6 or h5 themselves, then we can take on g6 and force them to recapture with the f-pawn, which is a much less ideal version of things. So here they play h6. Now part of the question here is, do we take on g6 right away, or do we maybe throw in the move bishop takes c6 first? I'm not 100% sure. We could play bishop takes c6, black has to take with the pawn, then take on g6. Black has to take with the pawn, and then black would have two sets of doubled pawns on the c file and the g file. The trade-off there would be that we would no longer have our light square bishop, so it might be a case where keeping the light square bishop alive is more worth it, but at the same time, it may not be more worth it, you know, it could kind of depend. I'm leaning more towards keeping the bishop alive, I will say, because I feel like even if we double the c-pawns, they're not that easy for us to attack in this position, I will say. So I think we're just going to take the bishop on g6. Black will take back, I assume. And then we will figure out what to do from there. I am leaning towards... leaning towards maybe just moving the bishop back to the e2 square and kind of just progressing from there. I'm not 100% sure. Maybe even just knight to c3 or something like that is also fine. Yeah, so the question is what to do here. I'd really like to play something like bishop d3 to attack the pawn. It is definitely an idea. However, black can maybe play king f7. I don't think that necessarily fixes all of black's problems by any means, but the bishop blocking the d-pawn's always a bit awkward in my mind. So I don't know if I'm really jumping to go for that right away. I think I will just go ahead and play knight to c3. And we will take it from here. If my bishop gets attacked, then I may go back to d3, depending on the circumstance. The slight drawback to our setup, I will say, is that we don't have any pawns in the center of the board, and black could potentially play e5 themselves and try to just gain a space advantage. That could be kind of annoying for us. Okay, I think I will go ahead and play d4, though, given the circumstance. I didn't want to go d4 previously, because queen to b4 check was still very annoying in my mind. So now queen to b4 is not a check anymore. So I will go d4, then I can drop the bishop back to the d3 square, move my queen, castle queenside. I do need to keep an eye on the g4 pawn, so probably queen e2, and then castle queenside is the idea here. Or queen f3 is even a possibility. But now we can bring the bishop back to d3 at some point without blocking our own d-pawn. That's kind of the part of the idea I'm thinking about here. At the same time, we might even be able to play pawn to f4, which would really cement our control over the e5 square. And if we can prevent black from pushing their pawn up to e5, then both the e6 pawn and even a little bit the g6 pawn become long-term liabilities. So what is black going to do about this? I think we're in very good shape strategically speaking here, but we are behind on development and we're not castled. So we do have a couple of short-term problems we need to solve. I think if we can play queen e2 and castle queenside, then I think we're in fantastic shape. But it depends on if black can stir up enough trouble in the meantime. If black can stir up trouble, things might be a little bit difficult. If they can't stir up trouble, then we're in good shape for sure. So the problem is, how do they stir up trouble? If they try to play pawn to e5, we could even take the knight on c6, force them to take back with the b pawn, and then something like that might be an option. Probably e5 is what they should go for, I will say. It's not. It requires some calculation, but I think that they should try a move like e5 to blast open the center of the board, trying to take advantage of our king, who is not able to castle right away. And if they go for e5, we'll have a little bit of stuff to figure out for sure. Now, if they make a slow move like bishop e7, then I think if we play f4 and take away the e5 move, then black is going to be in big trouble. It looks like they disconnected, so not sure what that means. Hopefully they come back, but I don't know. We'll see what happens here. I think this position is still interesting. We might even be a tinge bit worse off here, quite honestly, if black does play e5, but I feel like if they don't play e5, we're better for sure. Okay, they end up abandoning the game. I don't know if their internet connection just went out or what happened here. Yeah, it actually says we are worse off in this position. So let's use the game review and check this out, because even though we got the win, I'm not super happy about the position. So let's move over to the game review and check things out here. All right, so apparently we played at an 81.2% accuracy to our opponent's 88.5. So we kind of got outplayed here, I will say. We had one mistake and one miss. And if we look at the graph, we were actually quite a bit better off for most of the game. We were up at kind of a 1.55 advantage at some point, which we'll see. It must be like it must be this d4 move that actually just gets us in trouble right at the right before they disconnect. So not really sure what happened with them, but let's see what we can learn from it. Because yeah, I must have made some mistake right at the end of the game before they disconnected. But okay, knight f3, d5, b3, knight c6. We've seen this opening before. e3, knight f6, make the pin, hit the bishop, hit the bishop again, knight to e5. All of these moves are strong. It is best for black, objectively speaking. They should go ahead and take the knight, and then that way they don't allow that whole situation of the knight on e5, the pawns on g4 and h4. That became a very dangerous position for black. Instead, though, they did allow that. They retreated, we attacked, bishop retreated, attacked again, queen to d6. And yeah, maybe here at the end of the day, the h4 move, maybe this idea of going after the bishop on g6 is not the best. f4 is apparently even stronger. You keep the knight defended, and I think the idea here is we are now threatening bishop a3. So for example, if black played bishop e7, now we have that bishop a3 idea, keeping the knight defended, and here black would be in big trouble. I think we could even do it this way. Bishop takes, pawn takes, knight takes. We fork all the pieces, and black is going to lose the bishop on e7. So yeah, that would be very strong. Black would have to do something about that threat. Instead, though, I went for h4, h6, and yeah, apparently I should not be rushing to take the bishop, which is a little bit surprising, I will say. Maybe part of the reason for not taking the bishop here is that we're not really able to attack the g6 pawn that easily. And so if we play f4 or d4 instead, we're able to maintain the strong knight on e5, which I guess is probably worth a little bit more than the bishop. There are many situations in a lot of openings and middle games where you do this knight e5, this h3, g4, knight e5, h4 sequence, and then a lot of the times once they do push their h-pawn, you do take the bishop on g6. Interestingly enough, you could kind of say that my pattern recognition here failed me a bit because it's a very common way to do things in other positions. Apparently in this one, it's not best to take the bishop, which I am a bit surprised by. But you could kind of tell as the game progressed that I was not super thrilled with my position, even when he disconnected. So knight c3, castles, and yeah, apparently I need to move my queen and develop it quickly. Queen e5 is apparently the best move, and then you even just allow black to take the pawn on g4 if they want to take it, I guess. But yeah, apparently this is the best way to play. And the idea, I think, is we're just trying to get the queen off the back rank so that we can castle as quickly as possible. d4 apparently was a big mistake because, yeah, now it does say that the best move for black is the move e5. And I thought that if he had played e5, I was intending on maybe capturing the knight first. Oh, but apparently queen takes, pawn takes, and then d4. Okay. I will be frank, I had missed this idea. Too many different things are attacked. My knight's hit, my rook is hit, I'm going to lose material. That would be very bad. So maybe if the queen had taken, then I can't take the e5 pawn, but if I can't take the e5 pawn, black is playing moves like bishop to b4, knight to e4, take on d4. It's black who has this lead in development and safer king, and my own king is kind of stranded in the center, which is not so good. So e5 is actually a very strong move from black's perspective, and this is what makes the d4 move not so good. d4 kind of gives black this pawn break opportunity, and even though I have the pair of bishops, and you would think, oh, maybe white should be fine if the position opens up because the pair of bishops are good in an open position, the big issue is that my king is stuck in the center of the board. If I could castle, then the e5 move, I think, loses a lot of its power, you could say. But if I'm not castled yet, e5 opening up the center of the board becomes very dangerous. So let's just say, for example, I played, let's say we gave black a couple of slow moves. Let's say I played queen e2. Let's say black played bishop e7, just as an example. Let's say I castle, they develop the rook, and then I play d4, just as an example. Now it doesn't. Now I'm going to assume that it doesn't think that e5 is the best move. Now if black plays e5, now it's a very, very good position for white, rather than the other way around. Now it's a plus 2.5 position for white here. Apparently you just continue blasting open the position. stuff like this, and then you can start taking the pawn on the d file, and black is in huge trouble here. The center of the board opening up doesn't work well for them in this case because we are already castled. However, in the actual game, if black had played, backing up here, if black had played e5 in this position, then we would have actually been in rough shape here. I don't want to say that we would have lost the game necessarily. I think that, we could hope to fight back here. Maybe, I don't know, something like bishop back to e2 or something like that. Pawns get traded. Maybe I can move the queen, try to castle. It would very much be an uphill battle, though, I will say. Black's position is better. Their lead in development, especially with the safer king and the fact that I can't castle that easily, would put a lot of pressure on my position. So definitely not a perfectly played game by me whatsoever. I think a big part of it here was this kind of almost misconception that taking the bishop on g6 and doubling the pawns when the f-pawn has to take is not actually the best move. I'm still a little bit surprised by that because in a large majority of situations that is the best way to play. You take the bishop and mess up the pawn structure. But apparently here that allows black to get too much counterplay. So if you do play a move like f4 or d4 or something like that, I was a little bit bothered by queen b4 check. I said this during the game. But apparently stuff like this is not enough of a threat because knight takes c6 and then bishop takes c6 is a very big problem. Even if black tries knight e4, take, king moves, take the rook, take on c3. Pretty much we're going to trade the queens and white's going to still be up the exchange in this position. So yeah, not the best way to do things, taking the bishop on g6. But the idea of knight e5 or h3, g4, knight e5, h4, the idea itself is fine. It's just that we may not necessarily need to rush to capture the bishop on g6 is what it comes down to. So, okay, our opponent abandoned the game or disconnected, whatever it might be. We ended up winning the game. But definitely some things to learn from in here. I didn't play the opening, or let's say I didn't handle the middle game, this particular decision of trading knight for bishop perfectly. Our opponent had some good chances, but we get the win. It is what it is. I'm not really sure what happened to our opponent this game. Anyways, though, so let's go ahead and get into our third game. All right, game number 3, going with knight f3 once more. We get another d5 game, so we go for b3. And this opponent goes for a very early f6. So our typical MO, you could say, is if our opponent is trying to play the move pawn to e5, we're going to make that as difficult as possible for them. Here we're going to play d4, take away that option. And I suppose we can still go bishop to b2 if we want to. I mean, the bishop is going to go there at this point, given the circumstance. So let's just stick with that. We'll kind of see what black decides to do. Okay, so if they're playing pawn to c6, usually I would say that if we don't have the ability to put the bishop on b5, then we should not play pawn to e3. However, I do also think at the same time, because black has played the move e6 and f6, I actually kind of want the bishop on the d3 square so I can maybe attack the king side that's weakened by the f-pawn. If the knight was on f6 already, then I may not go for the bishop d3 setup. But given the fact that the pawn is on f6, I think I'm going to go for e3 and bishop d3. Because the nice thing is we can potentially play pawn to e4 or pawn to c4 in the near future to gain more space and to open up the position. So we're going to castle first. And most likely we're going to play one of these two pawn breaks, whether it's c4 or e4. We're probably going to go for c4 first, I was going to say, but as soon as black plays h5, I feel like this is more so asking for an e4 move, because now that black has played h5, they are more likely to keep the king in the center of the board, is my impression. And now I want to open up the center of the board ASAP. And so now I'm liking e4 more than I did previously. So let's go e4. And we're just going to try to play around the opening up of the position. That's the game plan here. for instance, if black plays, I was going to say, if they played something like, let's say, pawn to g5 here, we would have actually been able to play pawn to e5 to attack the bishop. And then if the f6 pawn disappears, then we would have been able to win the g5 pawn with the knight later. So black brought the bishop backwards. I'm not sure if they're planning some kind of queen d6 move. Not really sure if that's part of the game plan here. I think I'm just going to stick with rook e1 and kind of just prepare to open up the center at the right time. King f7. Okay, black's playing some really weird stuff here. I don't necessarily want to take and have them recapture with the e-pawn and open up the bishop necessarily. I think I'm going to go for c4 and then knight c3 and really, again, just try to open things, gain more space, but then we're ready to trade pawns and open things at the right time. That's the way I'd put it here. Bishop d7 is also very odd. You're blocking off the protection of the d-pawn. So now, for example, if I go knight c3, and then maybe even queen to e2, I think opening up the e-file and taking on d5 at the right time is definitely becoming more and more of a possibility here. And if we can open the position up, then we just kind of crack things open in a way that's very favorable for us. a6. To be honest with you, I don't really understand what black is doing here, to be quite frank. Not really sure. I mean, now the knight can't develop. I really wish this knight was gone because I want to play queen f3. I think we'll go for... Actually, I think bishop a3 could be very annoying here because I want to take the knight. Hold on. So I think I can find the right order of events. So I think I'm going to... Hold on. Yeah, I want to make sure I do this correct. Bishop a3, if we can eliminate the knight that's protecting d5, I think if we can do that, then we can absolutely rip open the position in a way that's very, very good for us. And I think bishop a3 is very strong. I'm just trying to check. There's only one move that's slightly bothersome, which would be maybe bishop a5. Maybe. And... so maybe what I can do to work around this, I think I'm going to trade this pair of pawns first. And then play bishop a3 next. Okay, so they take back with the c-pawn. I think I might have completely forgot that this knight can come out and defend the knight. Okay, it's a little bit annoying. Okay, I think I'm still going to go for bishop a3. In hindsight, maybe bishop a3 first was a little bit better, but okay, I'm going to go bishop a3. He's probably going to develop the knight. If he doesn't develop the knight, I am threatening... Okay, so he doesn't develop the knight, so that's a big mistake, I think. So we can now play bishop takes e7. Regardless of which way black recaptures, then we can take the pawn on d5. I don't want to take the pawn on d5 right away. That could also be good, too. If I take right away and then the knight takes, we could trade knights and then check on e7, and I think that would also be a very dangerous position for black. But taking the knight first is also very strong, I will say. I'm not sure. They're probably both very good here, to be quite honest with you. Do I take the knight then the pawn, or do I take the, do I take the pawn first? I kind of feel like I should be taking the knight first, to be quite honest with you. So I think I'm going to do it this way. Let's take this. And then I want to take with the pawn. Taking with the knight also looks very good because we take advantage of the e-file being pinned. But after the queen moves, I take the bishop, they take back. I really want to do something about the e6 pawn, is what I'm thinking. if I can get rid of the e6 pawn or open up the e file, that's kind of a more ideal version of things, is the way I'm thinking of it. So I'm going to take the pawn. They're b4, interesting, not what I would have thought. But now I can take on e6 with check. Black's going to take with the bishop. And now I don't necessarily need to move this knight. I might be able to just play bishop c4 here, take advantage of the bishop on e6 that's pinned, and I think black runs into very, very big trouble. I can also do it with d5 first. d5, they take the knight, I take on e6. That also looks very strong, but I like the idea of not having a pawn blocking e6. I kind of want to take on e6 with a piece, more so than I want to take with a pawn. And I think here black's just completely busted. If they take on c4, we take the queen. If they take on c3, we take on e6. And yeah, I don't think black really has a way to solve these problems. Very weird opening from our opponent. I mean, this guy's almost 2100 rated, and he played like f6, c6, a6, b5. Didn't really develop the queen side. Moved his king to f7. Not really so sure what happened with the opening phase for our opponent here, but we're happy to take advantage of it. Okay, I'm going to take with the rook because I want to set up more discovered checks. If he takes with the queen, that's totally fine with me. Yeah, okay, we'll just take the queen. I can just check with the queen and then take the pawn on c3 next move, and then we'll use the open c file to attack. The open c and e files, both of them are open at the same time. So we hit the bishop. He could try rook c8 to be a little bit tricky, threatening bishop takes h2. But he doesn't do that. We go queen to c4 check. He's probably going to play like king g6 or something weird. But we can always put the queen on d5. Yeah, I was going to say, how did I know? He's going to play something weird. I think I'll just go queen d5. I think this is simple enough. I attack the rook. I attack the bishop. Can't guard both of them. I'll take one of the two pieces next move, and then we're just getting a bigger and bigger material advantage. So, yeah, once we take the bishop, once the rook goes to a7, or black plays knight d7 or something like that. Okay, he decides to sacrifice for one pawn. Understandable. However, we're still going to keep attacking here. I think we can go something like knight h4 check. King has to go to h7 or h6. Here we play queen f5. I don't think there's a good answer for queen to g6 checkmate. I think it's pretty much we could pre-move it here. There's literally no move as far as I can tell that stops queen to g6 from being checkmate. So we can even just do it there. Yep. So we get the win. Very odd opening from our opponent, but we'll go back in the game review and check things out here in just a second. All right, so we played at an 89.9% accuracy to our opponent's 72.7. We had one mistake somewhere in there, but overall a pretty solid game. Let's check it out. So knight f3, d5, b3. Yeah, f6 is already a little bit of an odd choice. We go for d4 in all of these situations. Again, whenever our opponent is trying to play e5, d4, bishop e2, knight f3, we're trying to prevent our opponent from putting the pawn on e5. So it does shut our bishop in when it's on the b2 square a little bit, but at the same time, f6 is not really a move that black is very happy to play. If you could move pawns backwards, black would love to just put the pawn back on f7. If he could play pawn back to f7, then I think his position is fine. But because that's not possible, his king is always going to be a bit weak, and we were able to take advantage of that in the game. So c6, I decided to go for e3. I think you could also go g3 and bishop g2. The computer says it's totally fine. But I figured now that the king is a little bit more exposed, I like the idea of putting the bishop on d3 a little bit more. So we did that, we castled, and then yeah, here e4 is a good idea. h5 is an odd move. I think given the circumstance, black pretty much should just castle the king, but then we would probably go for one of these pawn breaks, c4 or e4, and white still has the advantage in a nice position. h5 was odd. I decided to go for e4 to prioritize opening up the center of the board. c4 is not a bad pawn break here either, but it doesn't open up the center as much. e4 opens up the center more because we can maybe get our rook on the e file. So e4, bishop c7, rook e1, king f7, c4, we end up going for both pawn breaks, bishop d7, I went knight c3, a6, decided to take the pawn first, and then apparently here is where I made kind of an error. I went for bishop a3, and it is definitely an important move for black to move the knight to c6 to defend their knight, because they need to keep this protection over the d5 pawn. In hindsight, it looks like I should have taken the pawn first, and then if they take back with the pawn, apparently rook takes e7 is very strong. I didn't really think about this during the game a whole lot, even though it does make a lot of sense. You end up winning a pawn for the exchange, and the king is exposed, and bishop c4 is coming. White has a very good position despite being down a little bit of material. It could also be possible for black to take with the knight instead, but then apparently we can trade knights, and then knight g5 check is a very strong move. If the pawn is taken, now queen f3 check. I guess the queen blocks. Take the pawn, bishop blocks. Take this pawn. The rook is in trouble, the bishop is pinned. Black is losing material. It's just too many things are weak in their position, and things are just falling apart for them. So, okay, I did miss this idea. I went for bishop a3 instead, but then pawn to b5 was also just a huge mistake. Took the knight. Could have taken with the knight on d5. I went for the pawn capture. Took another pawn, went after the pinned piece. And for all intents and purposes, the rest of the game is pretty straightforward. We just win the material, win the queen, pick up the pawn, fork the queen, fork the rook and the bishop, check, and eventually get checkmate. Okay, so that's the 3 different games for this rating range of 2,000 up to 2,100. I will also be doing a episode for 2,100 up to 2,200. I know in the past episodes I talked about maybe stopping at the rating of 2,000. I'm going to do these 2 extra episodes at the very least, get up to 2,200, and yeah, hopefully people enjoy the little bit higher rated content. And yeah, so hopefully you enjoyed this video. I'll have another one very soon with the 2,100 to 2,200 rating range. Right now, the Ready Nimzo Larson course is on sale if you're watching this the day it comes out. It will be on sale for another 2 days, I believe, maybe a day and a half. So if you do like this opening and you would like to learn more about this opening, I do have a course on Chessable that was shown at the very beginning of the video, I believe. And so if you're interested in that, check out the link in the description below. And hopefully enjoy this. If you want to see more episodes of the Speedrun series, it's going to be in the playlist to the left here. I will see you in the next video.